Oklahoma and Nebraska. This might have been the most devastating loss in college football history. Oklahoma and Nebraska didn't just play each other, they defined what college football could be at its absolute peak. From 1971 to 2001, these two programs met annually, and it felt like the winner was probably going to compete for a national championship. The 1971 game of the century between number 1 Nebraska and number 2 Oklahoma drew the largest television audience in college football history at that time. Johnny Rodgers, the Nebraska punt returner, took one back 72 yards for a touchdown that's still replayed today. Nebraska won 35-31, but that was just the beginning of 3 decades of absolute madness. These teams combined for 8 national championships during their annual rivalry period. 8. That's not a coincidence. Playing each other every year made both programs better, tougher, more prepared for the biggest moment. The winner of Oklahoma-Nebraska went to the Big 12 championship game almost every single year. But here's what made it special beyond the wins and losses. This rivalry had genuine respect mixed with genuine hatred. Both fan bases understood they were watching something historic, but they also couldn't stand each other. Nebraska fans would drive down to Norman talking about how Oklahoma was all hat and no cattle. Oklahoma fans would head north claiming Nebraska was just a bunch of corn farmers who got lucky. The 2001 game was supposed to be the end, with Nebraska heading to the Big Ten. Oklahoma won 20-10. And it felt like watching the death of something beautiful. They've played 8 additional times since, but it's not the same. There's no conference championship implications, no annual build-up, no guarantee they'll meet again next year, though they are scheduled to meet in 2029 and 2030. What's crazy is how both programs have struggled to find that same level of consistent excellence since the rivalry ended. Oklahoma's had great seasons, sure, but Nebraska, they've been searching for relevance ever since they left the Big 12. Maybe that's just coincidence, or maybe playing Oklahoma every year was what kept both programs sharp. Michigan, Notre Dame. Michigan and Notre Dame played each other 42 times between 1887 and 2014, and somehow the series ended 25-17-1 in favor of Michigan. That's the kind of balance that makes a rivalry legendary, but it's also what makes its ending so frustrating. This wasn't just any rivalry. It was college football royalty going at each other's throats. Michigan had the big house, Notre Dame had the mystique, and when they played, it felt like the sport's past and present colliding. The 2011 game under the lights at Michigan Stadium drew over 114,000 people and felt like a religious experience. But Notre Dame's independence created scheduling nightmares, and Michigan's Big Ten obligations made annual games impossible. The Irish wanted flexibility to play different opponents. Michigan needed conference games, and something had to give. What gave was one of college football's most storied matchups. The final game in 2014 was everything you'd want from this rivalry. Notre Dame won 31-0 in a game that wasn't close, and Michigan fans had to watch their season implode against their most prestigious non-conference opponent. It was a fitting end to the annual rivalry that always seemed to bring out the best and worst in both programs. They met up again in 2018 and 2019, but it's not the same as knowing you'll see each other on the schedule every single year. The anticipation, the preparation, the way both teams would circle that date, all of that's gone now. Texas A and M. Texas. If you want to understand how conference realignment destroyed college football's soul, look no further than Texas A&M and Texas. These schools are 100 miles apart. They've been playing since 1894, and their rivalry was so intense it had its own name, the Lone Star Showdown. This wasn't just football. It was cultural warfare. Texas represented the establishment, the big city, the program that got all the attention and resources. Texas A&M was the military school, the agricultural college, the little brother that was tired of living in Texas's shadow. When they played, it was about way more than football. The rivalry peaked in the 2000s when both programs were consistently ranked, and the Big 12 South was the toughest division in college football. The 2011 game was supposed to be the end, with A&M heading to the SEC. Texas won 27-25, and Aggies fans stormed the field anyway because they knew they were leaving for something bigger. But both fan bases still hate each other with a passion that's almost irrational. A&M fans will tell you they don't miss the rivalry, Then spend 20 minutes explaining why Texas is overrated. Texas fans claim they're better off without A&M. Then get genuinely angry when the Aggies have success in the SEC. The best part? They're both in the SEC now, which means this rivalry might actually come back. But it'll never be the same as those Big 12 days when the winner controlled the conference and the loser went home wondering what went wrong. Looking for more breakdowns of college football's legendary moments? Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next video. Missouri, Kansas. The border war between Missouri and Kansas wasn't just a football rivalry, it was literally rooted in actual war. These states fought each other during the Civil War era, with pro-slavery Missouri and anti-slavery Kansas engaging in violent conflicts that left lasting scars. That historical hatred translated perfectly to football. Missouri and Kansas played each other 104 times between 1891 and 2011, and every single game felt personal. The winner got bragging rights for an entire year, and the loser had to live with the shame of falling to their most hated enemy. The rivalry had everything you could want: close games, upsets, controversy, and genuine animosity between fan base. The 2007 game was peak border war. Both teams were ranked in the top 5, College game day was in town, and the winner was heading to the Big 12 championship game. Missouri won 36-28 in a game that felt like it decided the entire conference. But Missouri's move to the SEC in 2012 killed the annual matchup, and both programs have struggled to replace what they lost. Missouri found success early in the SEC, but has been inconsistent since. Kansas? They've been one of the worst programs in college football, though they've shown signs of life recently. The saddest part is how much both fan bases still care about each other. Missouri fans will claim they don't miss Kansas, then immediately start talking about how terrible the Jayhawks are. Kansas fans insist they're better off without Missouri, then celebrate whenever the Tigers lose an SEC game. They've brought the rivalry game back this season and have 3 additional games scheduled through 2032. What used to be a guaranteed annual bloodbath is now a periodic treat, and college football is worse for it. Penn State, Pittsburgh. Pennsylvania is a big enough state for 2 major college football programs, but apparently not big enough for Penn State and Pittsburgh to keep playing each other regularly. The Keystone Classic was everything a state rivalry should be: intense, personal, and absolutely crucial for recruiting the best players in Pennsylvania. Penn State and Pitt played 100 times between 1893 and 2019, with Penn State holding a slight 53-43-4 advantage. But the numbers don't tell the whole story of how much these programs and fan bases genuinely disliked each other. Penn State fans saw Pitt as a city school that couldn't compete with their tradition and success. Pitt fans viewed Penn State as arrogant suburban kids who thought they were better than everyone else. The rivalry peaked in the 1970s and 1980s when both programs were national powers. Penn State won national championships in 1982 and 1986, while Pitt claimed the 1976 title. When they played during those years, it felt like the winner might go on to win it all. But Penn State's move to the Big Ten in 1993 complicated the annual matchup. They kept playing sporadically, but it wasn't the same as knowing you'd face your biggest rival every single year. The anticipation, the preparation, the way both teams would save their best shots for each other, all of that got diluted when the game became an occasional occurrence rather than an annual tradition. The final game in 2019 was a 17-10 Penn State victory that felt more like a funeral than a celebration. Both programs have moved on to other priorities, but Pennsylvania high school players are the ones who really lost. They used to have 2 in-state powers competing for their attention every year. Now they have to choose between programs that barely acknowledge each other's existence. Oklahoma, Oklahoma State. Bedlam was the perfect name for this rivalry because that's exactly what it created: absolute chaos, unpredictability, and the kind of emotional swings that could define entire season. Oklahoma and Oklahoma State played 118 times between 1904 and 2023, and the Sooners dominated with a 91-20-7 record. But that lopsided series record doesn't tell the whole story. This was the ultimate big brother-little brother rivalry, and Oklahoma State spent decades trying to prove they belonged on the same field as the Sooners. Most years, they didn't, but when they did, it was spectacular. spectacular. The 2011 game was peak bedlam. Both teams were undefeated, both were in the national championship conversation, and Oklahoma State won 44-10 in a game that announced their arrival as a legitimate national power. What made Bedlam special was how much it meant to Oklahoma State and how little Oklahoma wanted to admit it mattered to them. The Sooners would claim it was just another game, then spend 2 weeks preparing like their season depended on it. Oklahoma State would openly admit this was their Super Bowl, then play with the kind of desperation that made them dangerous. The rivalry officially ended when Oklahoma moved to the SEC in 2024, and both sides handled it about as poorly as possible. Oklahoma acted like they were too good for the rivalry. Oklahoma State fans claimed they were happy to see the Sooners leave, and everyone involved pretended this wasn't a massive loss for college football. Nebraska, Kansas. Most people don't remember that Nebraska and Kansas used to hate each other, but for decades, this was one of the most intense rivalries in the Big Eight. They played 117 times between 1892 and 2010, and while Nebraska dominated with a 91-23-3 record, the games were often closer and more meaningful than the series record suggests. This rivalry peaked in the 1960s and 1970s when both programs were consistently competitive, and the Big Eight was one of the toughest conferences in college football. Kansas had some genuinely great teams during that era. What made this rivalry interesting was how it represented two different approaches to college football. Nebraska was all about power, tradition, and doing things the right way. Kansas was scrappier, more willing to take risks, and always looking for ways to level the playing field against superior talent. The rivalry faded as Nebraska became a national power, and Kansas struggled to keep up, but it officially ended when Nebraska left for the Big Ten in 2011. Both programs have struggled since then. Nebraska has been searching for relevance in the Big Ten, while Kansas has been one of the worst programs in college football until recently. Missouri, Nebraska. Missouri and Nebraska played each other 104 times between 1892 and 2010, and their rivalry was built on geographic proximity and genuine dislike. These were neighboring states with similar cultures but completely different football philosophy, and when they played, it was always personal. Nebraska represented everything Missouri fans hated about college football: tradition, success, and a fan base that acted like they were better than everyone else. Missouri was everything Nebraska fans found annoying: flashy, unpredictable, and always talking about what they were going to do, instead of what they'd already accomplished. The rivalry peaked in the 2000s when both programs were competing for Big 12 North titles, and the games actually mattered for conference championships. The 2003 game was particularly memorable. Missouri upset Nebraska 41-24 in a game that announced the Tigers as a legitimate threat in the Big 12. But both programs' moves to different conferences, Nebraska to the Big Ten, Missouri to the SEC, ended the annual matchup. They've both found success in their new homes, but something was lost when they stopped playing each other every year. The familiarity, the predictable hatred, the way both teams knew exactly what to expect from each other, all of that disappeared when conference realignment prioritized TV money over regional rivalry. Iowa State, Missouri. The telephone trophy might sound like a joke, but Iowa State and Missouri took their rivalry seriously for decades. They played 104 times between 1896 and 2011, and while the games weren't always pretty, they were always meaningful to both programs and fan bases. This was a classic Big 8/Big 12 rivalry between two programs that were usually fighting for respectability rather than championship. Iowa State and Missouri were often the conference's middle-tier team, which made their annual matchup feel like a measuring stick for both programs' progress. The rivalry had its moments of genuine excitement, particularly in the 2000s when Missouri became a consistent winner, and Iowa State had some surprisingly good teams. The 2011 finale was a 52-17 Missouri victory that felt like a mercy killing for a rivalry that had run its course. Missouri's move to the SEC ended the annual series, and both programs have had to find new ways to measure their success. Missouri has had more success in the SEC, while Iowa State has become one of the Big 12's more consistent programs, but neither has found a replacement for the familiarity and predictability of their old annual matchup. Stanford, USC. Stanford and USC represented two completely different approaches to college football success, and their rivalry was always about more than just wins and losses. USC was the glamorous program with Hollywood connections and five-star recruits. Stanford was the academic powerhouse that had to be smarter and more disciplined to compete. They played 103 times between 1905 and 2019, and USC dominated with a 65-34-3 record. But Stanford had some memorable victories that felt like David beating Goliath. The 2007 upset was peak Stanford. They were 41-point underdogs against USC and won 24-23 in one of the biggest upsets in college football history. What made this rivalry special was how it represented the eternal conflict between athletic excellence and academic achievement. USC fans would claim Stanford was just a bunch of nerds who got lucky occasionally. Stanford fans would argue that USC was all flash and no substance, and that their victories meant more because they were earned by smarter players. The rivalry faded as both programs went in different directions. USC dealt with sanctions and coaching changes, while Stanford became a consistent Pac-12 contender under David Shaw. But the annual matchup was always circled on both teams' calendars because it represented something bigger than football. Penn State, West Virginia. Penn State and West Virginia might seem like natural rivals. Two programs from neighboring states with similar cultures and passionate fan bases. They played 59 times between 1904 and 1992. And while Penn State dominated with a 48-9-2 record, the games were often more competitive than the series record suggests. This rivalry peaked in the 1980s when both programs were consistently ranked and competing for national recognition. West Virginia had some genuinely great teams during that era, and their victories over Penn State were always celebrated like national championships. What made this rivalry interesting was the cultural divide between the two states. Penn State represented the more urban, sophisticated side of the region, while West Virginia was seen as more rural and blue-collar. When they played, it felt like a clash between different versions of Appalachian identity. The rivalry officially ended when Penn State joined the Big Ten in 1993, but both fan bases still remember the intensity of those annual matchups. West Virginia fans particularly remember their upset victories as proof that they could compete with anyone, while Penn State fans mostly remember dominating a program they felt was beneath them. Louisville, Cincinnati. Louisville and Cincinnati were separated by just 100 miles and the Ohio River. But their rivalry was built on much more than geography. These were two programs fighting for respect in a region dominated by bigger names, and when they played, it was always about proving who deserved to be taken seriously. They played 54 times between 1929 and 2013, with Louisville holding a slight 30-23-1 advantage. The series was always a close matchup with every game feeling like it could go either way. The rivalry peaked in the 2000s when both programs were consistently competitive in the Big East and Conference USA. The 2006 game was particularly memorable. Both teams were ranked, both were undefeated, and Louisville won 23-17 in a game that felt like it decided the entire conference. Georgia Tech, Alabama. Here's something most college football fans don't know. Georgia Tech is mentioned in Alabama's fight song. "Send the Yellow Jackets to a watery grave" is a line that dates back to when these programs genuinely hated each other and played regularly. Georgia Tech and Alabama played 52 times between 1902 and 1984, and their rivalry was built on mutual respect and genuine dislike. Alabama represented the traditional Southern football powerhouse, while Georgia Tech was the engineering school that had to be smarter and more innovative to compete. The rivalry peaked in the 1960s and 1970s when both programs were consistently ranked and competing for national championships. Georgia Tech's 1990 national championship team was built on the foundation of competing with programs like Alabama every year. But Georgia Tech's move to the ACC in 1983 ended the regular series, and both programs moved on to other priorities. Alabama became a consistent national championship contender, while Georgia Tech has struggled to maintain the same level of success in the ACC. In a fun return to their roots, the teams are scheduled to meet in Atlanta in 2030 to kick off their season. The fact that Alabama still sings about Georgia Tech in their fight song is a reminder of how intense this rivalry once was, and how much college football has lost when geographic and cultural rivalries get sacrificed for TV money and conference realignment. Baylor, Texas A&M. Baylor and Texas A&M played each other 108 times between 1899 and 2011, and their rivalry was always overshadowed by bigger names in Texas, but was genuinely intense for both programs and fan base. These were two schools with completely different identity. Baylor was the small Baptist university, A&M was the large military-influenced agricultural school, but they were both fighting for respect in a state dominated by Texas. The rivalry peaked in the 2000s when both programs were consistently competitive in the Big 12, and their annual matchup often had conference championship implications. The 2011 finale was a 55-28 Aggie victory. A&M's move to the SEC ended the annual series, and both programs have had dramatically different trajectories since then. A&M has seen big recruiting classes and lucrative donor money-raising expectations, while Baylor has dealt with scandals and coaching changes, but has also had some surprisingly successful seasons. BYU, Utah State. Before the BYU and Utah game became known as the Holy War, BYU and Utah State was the rivalry that defined college football in Utah. They played 87 times between 1922 and 2012, and while BYU dominated with a 51-37-3 record, the games were often closer and more meaningful than the series record suggests. This was a classic in-state rivalry between two programs with completely different identities. BYU represented the Mormon establishment and had more resources and national recognition. Utah State was the agricultural school that had to fight for everything they got and took special pride in beating their more famous rivals. The rivalry peaked in the 1970s and 1980s when both programs were consistently competitive, and their annual matchup felt like it decided bragging rights for the entire state. Utah State's victories were always celebrated like national championships, while BYU's wins were expected but still satisfying. BYU's independence and later move to the Big 12 has made the annual game impossible to schedule, and both programs have had to find new ways to measure their success. But for decades, this was the game that mattered most to both fan bases. Notre Dame, Michigan State. Notre Dame and Michigan State played for the Megaphone Trophy for decades, and their rivalry was built on geographic proximity and completely different approaches to college football. Notre Dame was the independent Catholic powerhouse with national recognition, while Michigan State was the Big Ten program that had to fight for respect in their own conference. They played 76 times between 1897 and 2013, with Notre Dame holding a 47-29-1 advantage. But Michigan State had some memorable victories that felt like program-defining moments, particularly their upset wins during Notre Dame's championship season. The rivalry peaked in the 1960s when both programs were consistently ranked and competing for national championship. Michigan State's 1965 and 1966 teams were built on the foundation of competing with programs like Notre Dame every year. But Notre Dame's scheduling flexibility as an independent made the annual game impossible to maintain, and both programs moved on to other priorities. They've played sporadically since then, but it's never been the same as those days when the Megaphone Trophy actually meant something to both programs. Texas A&M, Texas Tech. Texas A&M and Texas Tech played 70 times between 1927 and 2011, and their rivalry was always about more than football. These were two programs representing different parts of Texas, A&M from the more traditional southeastern region, Tech from the wide-open plains of West Texas. And when they played, it was about proving which version of Texas football was superior. The rivalry peaked in the 2000s when both programs were consistently competitive in the Big 12, and their annual matchup often had bowl implications. Tech's high-powered passing offenses under Mike Leach created some memorable shootouts against A&M's more traditional approach. A&M is still looking to establish a consistent foothold in the SEC, while Tech has remained competitive in the Big 12 despite coaching changes and conference instability. Conference realignment has sacrificed the historic regional rivalries that defined college football. Annual traditions that connected generations of fans, like the games between Oklahoma and Nebraska or Texas A&M and Texas, have been destroyed in the pursuit of TV money and greater efficiency. The saddest part is that most of these legendary rivalries are unlikely to ever return to their former glory due to scheduling conflicts and conference obligation. If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next video. We're covering more college football history every week.